Welcome back to the Black Table, our hour devoted to exploring ideas and subjects of special importance to African people and others fighting to build a better world. I'm your regular host, Reg Carr, and if you're a regular watcher of the Black Table here on the Black Star Network, you know that we continuously come back to this theme here in the U.S., although I know we have a global audience, of the fight for a better society here in the United States of America. We've had some transformative thinkers involved in this conversation over the arc of our early iterations here at the Black Table. But today, I almost feel like we've been building toward having a bit of a conversation with this brother. He's a long distance runner in this struggle to build a better society here in the United States. He's a civil rights lawyer. He's been a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He is a political analyst, an institution builder, a columnist, and an opinion shaper in a wide range of media, commercial and independent media. And certainly we're glad to have him here at the Black Table. He's the host of a podcast, Democracy in Color, with Steve Phillips, and the founder of the political media organization, Democracy in Color. And he's the author of two books, one of which, well, both of which, but really one of which we'll concentrate on today. This excellent 2016 text, which is a bestseller, New York Times bestseller, Brown is the New White: How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority. And the one we'll be kind of centering on today, a remarkable book entitled How We Win the Civil War: Securing Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good. So here at the Black Table, we're welcoming to the table today, Brother Steve Phillips. Welcome, Steve. Glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to the conversation.
Oh, yes, sir, man. And we know you're no stranger to the Black Star Network. And we told Roland we wanted to schedule you. He was excited. And I certainly am excited as well, having followed you for some time. In fact, what we normally do when we talk with authors is get a little bit of a background of their personal journey. And as we were talking before we came on, like probably most of us of African descent in the United States, your folk came originally from the South. But you ended up on the West Coast for a long stretch, up to and including now. And I was intrigued even thinking about you being a young person running for the school board in San Francisco. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you come to this moment?
Yeah, no, I'd say I'm quite literally a child of the civil rights movement. In that I grew up my grandfather was from Mississippi, my grandmother was from Alabama, and like you're saying, like most African Americans came up to the North during the Great Migration. As Bill Wilkerson in her book Warmth on the Other Sun says that there was a moment where most Black people in the South, which meant most Black people in the country, had a decision to make in terms of really where they were going to go. So I grew up in the greater Cleveland area. You're saying a child of civil rights movement. They would not sell my parents the house we grew up in because they were Black. Had to get a white civil rights lawyer to buy the house and deed it over to us in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. My brother was the first Black student at the local elementary school. One of my earliest memories was as a 3 or 4 year old going to see Martin Luther King in Cleveland when he came to visit. And so, and I was the milieu of the civil rights movement really was a big major factor in my life. We had different books around the house. I read all the biographies of Martin Luther King in my elementary school library. So that was a major driving force. And then my grandfather was a minister. Glenville Church of God. And so that was another shaping factor. And I was also very interested in politics from a very young age. My next door neighbor, Art Brooks, ran for state legislature. And so when I was like 8 or 10, something like that. So I had all those different elements. And then a lot of that came together for me when I was in college. So yeah, I came west to go to Stanford and to go to college. And when Jesse Jackson ran for president, all of these different pieces came together. Direct, tangible connection to the civil rights movement. He'd been there with Dr. King. That, a lot of religious language and metaphor, the whole church tradition, the civil rights and the political expression. And for a 20-year-old, Black kid, it was all very compelling. And so that was a major influence. And I like to say I've been trying to build the small R rainbow ever since. And that's really what has kept me involved and engaged. Ran for the school board in San Francisco. We then created the first super PAC in the country when Obama ran in 2006. And so I've been on this journey to try to manifest what I had got a taste of during the Rainbow, that when the old minorities come together, they comprise a new majority. And I do believe that that arc is where politics is at and where it's going. And I've tried to illuminate that in both of my books.
Thank you, Steve. That, I mean, man, just that snapshot, I think, is so telling. And particularly since, you know, having come of age during that period, and then you empty all of that grounding, all of that kind of imagining, all that institution building as you narrate the institutions, including the Black church. You mentioned an uncle who's a journalist, those Black institutions emptying into that will as you go into California. That Jackson campaign, I was at Tennessee State. I was a young man myself in '84. We volunteered, but you were involved at another level. And it's fascinating to hear you talk about this, because in Brown is the New White, where you really are trying to shake, among other things, the Democratic Party by the shoulders and said, stop talking and chasing these people who don't exist. You're speaking from experience. And I'm thinking about the work that you all did before we went on. We mentioned Ron Walters, his book, Black Presidential Politics in America. I think about how he tried to say the same thing. What you all were doing was literally trying to forge a new majority. And of course, Ron Brown ends up coming out of that campaign, and then he goes over into the Democratic National Committee. And we see the Democratic Party go in a direction you're trying to offer a corrective of, and Brown is the New White. I wonder if you might say a few words about, particularly since I think it was chapter 2 of Brown is New White, where you kind of map this emerging majority in this country. Could you say a few more words about this potential rainbow that we are literally sitting in the midst of right now? Because a lot of people hear rainbow and rainbow coalition, but particularly for young people, they might not know what that means.
Right. Yeah. No. And actually, one of the people I dedicate Brown is the New White to is Reverend Jackson. And
yes.
I talk about how, he showed the power and potential of a movement for social justice manifested in the electoral space. I say I was paying attention. And so it's, again, Jesse's, synthesis of it was, when the old minorities come together, they comprise a new majority. In the '84 convention speech, which at one point I knew word for word back in the day.
This is the one from '84?
'84 in San Francisco.
Young people, I encourage you all, if you go to YouTube, watch that speech, because that convergence, Coretta Scott King, everybody is there. Yeah, our time has come, I think. Was that the name?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, right. So he says in there, he says, when Blacks vote in great numbers, progressive whites win. It's the only way progressive whites win. And then he says, when Blacks vote, Hispanics win. Says we must all come up together. And so he really pointed the path and illuminated and showed the power. That's the other piece. It wasn't even just a conceptual idea. Jesse in '84 had 3.5 million votes, 400 delegates. '88, he had 7 million votes, 1,200 delegates. To that time, he was the highest second place finisher in the history of the country. So he had proved the power and potential of this movement. And so that was very clear to me all along. And then the continued demographic transformation of the country. One of the things, we have this chart in Brown is the New White showing that every single day there are 7,000 people of color added to the population compared to 1,000 whites. And so that's a combination of births and deaths and legal immigration. And one of the things we don't understand is, and actually I wound up doing some of the analysis of, it's like, because we take it such a granted take it for granted so much that the country is so white. And I was like, what percentage of the world are white people?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It's only about 12% of the people in the whole world are white. And so this notion that everybody who's white, people of color, are a minority is very unnatural. And it's unnatural because there's very intentional exclusion for centuries. The very first immigration law, so to be a citizen, you have to be a free white person. This is 1790 immigration law. And that was good law till the 1950s, and it was the practice until the 1960s. So it's really only taking down the exclusionary barriers that have made the country more diverse. And so we've gone from people of color being 12% of the population in 1965 to being 40% today. And so that's what has enabled there to be a complete transformation of politics in this country. Historically, politics has been a competition between white people. You had conservative whites and liberal whites competing over the whites who are in the middle.
Yes.
But it's this point, just to say that when we vote, blacks vote in great numbers, people of color vote in great numbers, progressive whites now allied with people of color are the majority of people. And that's what we try to break down in Brown is the New White. The chapter 2 is Meet the New American Majority. Yes. And so if you take the Obama percentages, 80% people of color, 39% of whites, and apply that to the population overall, it's not a huge majority, which is why it's a political struggle to get people to actually see it and understand it. But it is a majority. It is the majority that propelled Obama. It's about 51%, probably closer to 52% now, of the whole U.S. population. 46% of all the Democratic voters are people of color. And it continues to grow. And so that's the fundamental. And the irony is that not only is it the fundamental driving reality in politics, it's a reality that the Republicans understand better than Democrats, which is why they're so hell-bent on trying to suppress the participation of people of color in politics. And Democrats do not counter that with the same level of intensity that the Republicans manifest.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think about Reince Priebus and his attempt to kind of, for whatever reasons, address that. And now people are saying, well, maybe they'll finally get it this time. Although, certainly if we take the premise of how we win the Civil War and that long arc of scholarship that you tap into, we won't hold our breath, as you said, in Brown is the New White. But we're going to come back in a moment and continue this conversation with you, Steve, here at the Black Table, here on the Black Star Network. And when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation, because what we see Steve Phillips do in How We Win the Civil War is give us a bit of a history in part 1 of the book as to why it is that this kind of race-focused, whiteness-focused country that we live in came to be how it is. And then in part 2, he begins to map out solutions, data-driven, civic participation-oriented organizing solutions. Back in a moment here at the Black Table.
Hi, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Fanbase is a free to download, free to use, next generation social media platform that allows anyone to have followers and subscribers on the same page. Fanbase was built through investment dollars from equity crowdfunding from the Jobs Act. People just like you help build Fanbase, and we're looking for more people to help build Fanbase. We are currently raising $17 million in a Regulation A crowdfund on StartEngine. We've already crossed $2.1 million, but we're looking to raise more capital from people just like you that deserve the opportunity to invest in early stage startups without having to be accredited investors. So right now, I'd like you to go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest. The minimum to invest is $399. That gets you 60 shares of stock in Fanbase right now, today. And then use Fanbase to connect with friends, grow your audience, and be you without limits.
Welcome back to the Black Table here at the Black Star Network. I'm Reg Carr, your host, joined by Steve Phillips, author of Brown is the New White and How We Win the Civil War. Steve, when we left, you had led us right up into the room. I want to spend just a couple more minutes maybe, though, in Brown is the New White, because you really try to alert us to the fallacious thinking of continuing to chase this kind of race-driven, whiteness-focused, particularly these invisible white workers-focused trajectory of Democratic Party leadership. And while you're discussing demographics and talking about the changes in demographics, we know that the changing of the population isn't enough. You got to do some work. And you're very, very aggressive in trying to lay out this corrective for party politics that is still anchored and oriented around whiteness. Why is that so important?
Well, it's a question of do we want to win, right? And so this is the fundamental issue in analysis. And so I actually went back and I did the number. I took the Obama percentages, right? We talked about before, 80% of people of color, roughly 39-40% of whites. That coalition with that shares of the racial groups would not have defeated Reagan. There were not enough people of color in the country at the time. And so Obama's victory, which still was not, which is really why I wrote Brown is the New White, because it seemed obvious to me that this was an extension of the civil rights movement, the Jackson campaign, bringing people of color into the process. We changed the composition of the electorate and we win elections. But that people were not at the tops of the Democratic Party and the progressive movement understanding or appreciating or acting on that. Like, no, we got to still keep chasing these, white swing voters, and that's what we have to do, is moderate our politics to try to woo them in ways that were alarming to me in terms of not understanding the prescription of what had actually worked. And I would, it seems clear to me that the years since Obama's election have only further affirmed that when you have high turnout, and high turnout of people of color in particular, that's the way to go about winning elections. But that's not, and I don't know why it's not people, I think it's a multiple set of reasons. I mean, some of it is people's own implicit bias in terms of they gravitate towards white voters, the most important voters, obviously. There was one of my favorite stories in 2018 is that there was a donor who was trying to get the House Majority PAC, the super PAC that was supposed to elect House of Representatives candidates, and they wanted to give money to try to flip the House. And they went to House Majority PAC, and they asked me where to go. And I said, what about go to California, Central Valley, David Valadeo's seat. It was a majority Latino district, and it was a very close election previously. If you could increase Latino turnout, you should be able to win that seat. This super PAC told people, don't go there. There's a lot of Latinos there. They don't vote in midterm elections. We should choose someplace else to go.
Wow.
And so we pushed and got them to go back, and they invested in Communities for New California. It's a grassroots organization, came out of the farm workers movement, and they knocked on 30,000 doors, made phone calls, won that seat by 800 votes. Huh. But the other part of that is that's hard work. And I think that's probably the other reason why folks don't want to go in that direction is it's much easier to sit in your desk and design, TV ads on your computer than having to organize and coordinate hundreds of people to knock on doors and make phone calls.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the only way, as you lay out in part 2 of how we win the Civil War, is really the only way to do it. But I mean, it's fascinating. It's fascinating, Steve, to think about this. I suppose we all take for granted that this country, as we were taught in school, as it exists, as we were taught in school, has remained somehow static. I'm thinking about a professor at Penn Law, Kermit Washington, has written a book called The Nation That Never Was. And he says there are basically two constitutions. There's the 1787 Constitution, and then there's the Reconstruction Constitution. And I found it fascinating because in reading your book, How We Win the Civil War, you really kind of bring out the fact that this is not only a work in progress, but you can't frame this country simply in terms of George Washington and James Madison, that it is constantly moving. The population shifts and changes, and the additions to it have transformed it generation after generation after generation. And as you say, as you lay out in Brown is New White, we want to win elections, yes, but in how we win the Civil War, though, you go deeper. You really are getting into the cultural roots, almost the existential kind of challenges faced by this kind of settler colonial nation state called United States of America. And when you frame this as a battle between those who want to hold on to white nationalism, or those who want to engage in what you call a Confederate kind of logics, Confederate moment, versus those who want to build a different kind of society, I mean, that's a transformative paradigm. Could you walk us through maybe part 1 of your book? I mean, what is that thesis? Is that really the battle of what we're facing here in this country?
It very much is the battle. I mean, the I don't know, irony is not even a strong enough word. So the publisher came to me, New Presses that published both my books. So they came to me in April of 2020.
And we should know, I said before, this is a COVID book. So anybody thinking it takes 10, 15, 20 years, although you spent your whole life in this work, you did this in 2 years?
Well, you say that that's a short amount of time, but yes.
Well, I mean, for an analysis like this, everybody's writing COVID books, but you can't write a book like this unless you spent decades thinking about and working in this work. But anyway, so I'm sorry. So they came to you in April 2020.
April 2020. And I was saying, because of how much divisions Trump had sowed, how clearly he was, a pro-white president, I was like, well, why don't we use the metaphor, just use the Civil War as a metaphor in terms of describing this period that we're in. And that 8 months later, people carrying the Confederate flag, wearing sweatshirts saying MAGA Civil War, January 6, 2021, stormed the U.S. Capitol, hunted down the country's elected officials, built a gallows for the vice president of the United States, and to block the peaceful transfer of power within this country. And I was like, well, this is not so metaphorical anymore. And so I titled the introduction of a choice between democracy and whiteness, which is a quote from Taylor Branch, who wrote the Parting the Waters civil rights books, and he was in conversation with Isabel Wilkerson. She recounts this in her book Caste. And they were talking about the rise of white domestic terrorism within this country. And he was saying people said they wouldn't stand for being a minority in their own country. So the question is that if given a choice between democracy and whiteness, how many would choose whiteness? And Wilkerson says, we let that hang in the air, neither of us willing to hazard a guess.
Yeah.
But my fundamental argument or illustration in the book is that the Confederates have never stopped fighting the Civil War. And I put this forward initially as a concept, but as I began to dig into the research, it actually is quite literally true, to the point where you have at its most clear that groups like Sons of Confederate Veterans, United Daughters of the Confederacy, they have hundreds of chapters, 700 chapters across the country. And then you can go onto their websites and you can buy Confederate belt buckles and soap and whatnot. So they've literally been moving the Confederate forward in that regard. But more broadly, this notion about, is this a white country or is this a multiracial democracy? That's what's been uninterrupted, that fight. And that everybody knows, obviously, Lincoln was assassinated, but I didn't even fully appreciate exactly when and why. So just 5 days after the supposed surrender at Appomattox, John Wilkes Booth, who had heard Lincoln's first speech after the supposed surrender, said, that means N-word citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever give. And then went and shot Lincoln at the back of the head.
My God.
Then you had, in the 1870, after the brief period of Reconstruction, the agreement to give the South back to the slaveholders. And so reestablishing white nationalist dominance for 100 years within this country. And so it's only since 64 and 65 that we've actually been trying to get more towards more multiracial democracy with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So it has been an uninterrupted battle around this existential question of, is this primarily a white nation, or is this going to be a multiracial democracy? And that continues to rage to this moment.
Yes. And it is truly remarkable. I mean, I think it's John Roadhamel has just written the book America's Original Sin, where he traces exactly what you said about the motivations behind what John Wilkes Booth, why he did what he did. And that's not a way that we typically read it in this country, the way that he's writing about it, the way that you're talking about it. And then I love how in part one of the book, chapters 2 and 3 say the 20th century, part 1, 50 years, one battle plan, the 20th century, part 2, 50 more years, same battle plan. You lay out this battle plan that they pursue. And one of the things I think is really strong about your text, you're building on the momentum of memory, because you tap into Lerone Bennett Jr., who's writing about this. You quote Black Power USA back in the 60s, and you quote Derek Bell, who is trying to bring, I think about Derek Bell talking about the principle of the involuntary sacrifice. You know, Black people are not in this to necessarily save America. It's probably more of an act of self-defense. But in doing that, we're literally thinking about a society where everybody can benefit. But why are people fighting so hard against everybody benefiting, Steve. That's what I understand. You kind of lay it out though.
Well, this has been the essence of our politics. They passed these black codes in the 1600s and the early 1700s because of the rapine nature of black folks. We had to be restrained. And so this fear of black people in particular and people of color in general has been an underlying force in terms of U.S. politics and policy and culture quite literally since 1619. And so none of this is new. And so then by contrast, they try to make it seem like they're going to lose something. Rosa Parks wasn't taking her seat on the bus so that black people could ride on the bus.
Right.
She took her seat so that everybody could ride on the bus. Voting Rights Act wasn't just about so black people could vote, it was so that everybody could vote. But that's not the way it gets experienced. And that's certainly not the way it gets described in terms of whipping up white fear and resentment. And the concern is that if we have expansion of democracy and equality, that then whites are going to lose something. And that's the dynamic that the conservatives are fanning those flames.
Yes. Well, when we come back, we want to continue this conversation, Steve, and have you walk us through the kind of process by which, as you write in the book, for 157 years since the end of the Civil War, this struggle has continued, and also walk us through the process by which we can not only fight back, but win. It's quite an optimistic book. So y'all just hold on for a minute. In a few minutes, we're going to get to the victory part. So we'll be back right after this break here at the Black Star Network at the Black Table. Back in a moment.
What's up, y'all? Look, Fanbase is more than a platform. It's a movement to empower creators, offering a unique opportunity for everyday people to invest in Black-owned tech, infrastructure, and help shape the future of social media. Investing in technology is essential for creating long-term wealth and influence in the digital age. The Black community must not only consume tech, we must own it.
Discover how equity crowdfunding can serve as a powerful tool for funding Black businesses, allowing entrepreneurs to raise capital directly through their community through the Jobs Act.
Welcome back to the Black Table here at the Black Star Network. Remember to support the Black Star Network. Download the app, tell your friends. There's nothing like this. Black-owned media where we're having different kinds of conversation, again, working to build a better world. So we're back with our guest today, Steve Phillips, author of How We Win the Civil War. Steve, you not only lay out the history of how we've come to this moment and how this resistance to a better society, a more democratic, in fact, multiracial democracy has kind of unfolded. But you actually, when you talk about the Civil War never ending, you give us a 5-step battle plan that has been pursued. Could you talk a little bit about what those 5 steps are and how they continue to manifest?
Yeah, so the second half of the book is really looking at this question of how we win. And
yes.
I look at case studies of 5 or of several places that have made actual progress, former right-wing or actual Confederate bastions, that there's been very significant political and social change in those areas over the course of the past decade. And I knew about them generally, really only when I was getting into writing about them that I began to fully grasp just how much it was really helpful in terms of the similarities of the different elements that were taking place in those different areas. And so that's what I describe as the Confederate, the first part of the Confederate battle plan. That's what I describe as the liberation battle plan in terms of how things actually move forward. And so the core elements of that are invest in level 5 leaders. And so this is a concept I took from Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, about looking at corporations. And they called level 5 leaders, who people are very personally, humble, but extraordinarily driven and demanding for their organizations. And so all of these different areas had, so, Georgia, Arizona, Virginia, San Diego, and Harris County, Texas, had those types of leaders. So the level 5 leaders, strong civic engagement organizations. And so as we were saying, there's a new American majority within the country, but it takes organization and discipline and methodical work to transform that population majority into a voting majority. And so that's the work of civic engagement organizations. That's the second part of the Liberation Battle Plan. The third part is detailed data-driven plans in terms of really being able to have deep data analysis of where to focus your time, energy, and efforts, where are the votes, where's the potential, and to really be able to marry the technological revolution with the demographic revolution. And then the fourth is play the long game. In each of those places, there's 10 years of uninterrupted work to methodically build up the political power and electoral influence. And that is what has enabled them to actually succeed. So those are the core components of the Liberation Battle Plan.
Excellent. So, and it's interesting that the final component in the Liberation Battle Plan is the same as the final component in the Confederate Battle Plan. Play the long game. But I mean, while this is going on, and there are a lot of questions I want to ask you, maybe we'll do that in the final block, or maybe even commingle it now, about how you're reading the current election cycle, particularly the midterms we just came from, what's going on in Georgia in terms of early voting, how you were thinking about that data. But these case studies, like you say, you're at the state level in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, who I know you've worked a long time with. I love how you write. Some of these people I'm gonna call by their first names because I've worked with them very closely. And Stacey Abrams, of course, being one. But as you lay out Arizona, is it John Laredo? I think is
John Laredo, yeah.
And Virginia with Trom Gwynn, I'm thinking about how in Brown is the New White, you lay out the demographic case, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, Black Americans. But here in How We Win the Civil War, you take the next step, as you say, you're profiling individuals who are representative of these movements, as you say, who are organizing. And as I was reading, I couldn't help but again think about your experiences with Rainbow Coalition, with the Jackson campaigns, your political organizing missions. What can we learn about that hard work that you mentioned in the first block that really is inevitable? We should really be embracing rather than trying to pay a bunch of consultants to carpet bomb the airwaves and things like that.
Right. So it's for people who come out of an understanding of social change and organizing. Right. So John is a perfect example of that. John Laredo in Arizona. So John was the head of the state legislature, the top Democrat in the state legislature in the early 2000s. But before that, he came out of the United Farm Workers movement. Cesar Chavez was a mentor of his. Mm-hmm. So he learned at the knee of one of the major social change, racial justice, economic justice organizers in this country's history, and then took those skills to the state legislature and to the process of building political power. So he convened a meeting of all the different major organizations, labor groups and community groups and political organizations. And he had this meeting, says, who's tired of getting your asses kicked? Raise your hand. And people raised their hands. So we need to all work together and develop a common plan that we're going to stick with and be able to move forward over the year. And over the course of a decade, they have registered hundreds of thousands of people of color, brought them into the electorate. This coalition has stayed together. They knocked on 3 million doors in Arizona this past election, had 1 million conversations with voters, and they won the governor's race by 17,000 votes. So that's a direct application of these civil rights and social justice community organizing skills and applying that to the electoral arena to great success. And so each of these different areas has had a similar story and a similar type of leadership who comes from these communities, who understands the nitty-gritty of how do you organize and stick with it, and then how do you manifest that and translate that to the electoral process.
Is that part of maybe even at the heart of how you transform attitudes? I mean, you write a lot, particularly as we think about the epilogue, where you talk about the possibilities of universal base income. you focus on that small city in California and the young brother who was elected, and how where that transformed the lives of the people who were favored there to get it. But and you contrast that with earlier in the book, of course, how people work so hard to take away health care, to restrict voting rights. But I mean, when you're knocking on doors like that, when you're engaging with people, when you're engaged in that person-to-person work, I'm thinking about, of course, Reverend Jackson in West Virginia with coal miners, with migrant, you know what I mean? And people say, well, why are you there with these white people? Say, no. This isn't about the color of their skin. This is about your common interests. Is it possible that these two-party politics we're involved in, that the folks who kind of run these parties and who have this old way of thinking, well, let me ask you a different way. Why cling to that? Why cling to those strategies when in fact we're dealing with human needs that people should be able to see beyond waste with? And it seems, at least, we can trust what you've been writing and doing and working, you and your comrades. You can transform people's thinking if you just simply sit and be with them, organize them. I mean, why won't these parties, certainly the Democratic Party, why won't they move in that direction?
Well, there's kind of two parts to it. And so I think the part of it is that I'm fundamentally more focused on changing who holds power than in changing attitudes. And that's really kind of across the board.
Thanks for clarifying.
And so
yes.
It's not, people did not think that, it wasn't about changing people's attitudes that enabled us to pass Obamacare. But because we passed Obamacare over the strenuous opposition of the right and the Republicans, that people of all backgrounds and all political persuasions got access to health care. Yes. So that's kind of how I see this playing itself out, is that they're going to resist. Like I recount a story of this guy in Tennessee who needed health care for his, I think it was his kidney disease. And he said, I'm not going to get Obamacare. He's only in his 40s. It's like, I don't want to give away, and I would rather die. And he died. And so the level of intensity, because this is an existential question, the way it has been framed in this country. I mean, if you think about the Civil War itself, right? I mean, the equivalent of 7 million people were killed as a percentage of the population. And so what would make somebody willing to take up arms and shoot your former countrymen and kill people at that scale if you didn't actually feel that your own identity, your own culture, your own way of life was in grave danger? So that's on that side of the scale. And then I think we touched a little bit before in terms of on the Democratic side. To a certain extent, people only know what they know, which is why you have to change who is in the positions of power. And there's very strong bias in this country that the white votes matter most, white people matter more. And so there's they keep having all these articles in the media about the Trump supporters and diners in the Midwest and how they're alarmed, like this whole, hillbilly elegy piece of, J.D. Vance, the dismay of white working class people, and somehow trying to put that on Democrats. And I'm like, well, where are the articles about the dismay of Black people? Because in terms of who's actually dealing with difficulties within this country, but that's not seen as that important. Yeah. And so there's just a very strong predisposition to focus in on the needs and the sensibilities of white voters among the people at the top of the Democratic Party. And as we were saying before, it's harder work to be able to get people who face lots of economic obstacles to participate in the political process than it is to just design, fancy ads on your computer, and then you can just click a button and spend millions of dollars in these different districts. So there's a inherent bias among the consultants against doing voter mobilization work, and then there's the lack of cultural competence about not even knowing how to do it and even how to even reach people of color on top of that.
Excellent. In fact, when we come back, Steve, we're going to finish our final segment by you hopefully giving us some of your perspective on what we've just gone through with the midterms and how we build, as you write in the epilogue, the society we want, after having to decide, as you kind of quote there, Nicole Hannah-Jones, beginning that section, what kind of society do we want? Do we want everybody to vote? Do we want everybody to participate? So when we come back, we'll finish this hour at the Black Table with our guest, Steve Phillips, author of How We Win the Civil War, Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good, here at the Black Star Network. Back in a moment.
Hi, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Fanbase is a free to download, free to use, next generation social media platform that allows anyone to have followers and subscribers on the same page. Fanbase was built through investment dollars from equity crowdfunding from the Jobs Act. People just like you helped build Fanbase, and we're looking for more people to help build Fanbase. We are currently raising $17 million in a Regulation A crowdfund on StartEngine. We've already crossed $2.1 million, but we're looking to raise more capital from people just like you that deserve the opportunity to invest in early stage startups without having to be accredited investors. So right now, I'd like you to go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest. The minimum to invest is $399. That gets you 60 shares of stock in Fanbase right now, today. And then use Fanbase to connect with friends, grow your audience, and be you without limits.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Remember to support the Black Star Network in every way. I'm your host, Reg Carr. We've been joined this hour by Steve Phillips, author of Brown is the New White and How We Win the Civil War. Steve, I have a couple of questions based on what you've seen in the wake of these midterm elections. You write extensively about Georgia, extensively about this level 5 leader, Stacey Abrams, the organizations that she helped build, that you all worked so hard to move. What's this early voting telling you in Georgia? I mean, we see that there are a lot of people who are out voting. There are a lot of young people. And then we know that quietly, there are also those who maybe don't want a multiracial democracy, who aren't perhaps on social media, but who are also going very quietly to their polling places and registering their votes. What is this early voting telling you, and what do you anticipate maybe might happen in Georgia?
Well, I think it's going to be close again, as it always has been, which comes back affirming the significance and importance of civic engagement organizations and voter mobilization work. I mean, as we saw with Biden winning and with Warnock and Ossoff winning, there is a majority of people, but in terms of being able who are part of this new American majority, progressive whites and people of color. But the core of that is people of color, and people of color have far more obstacles in their lives, gargantuan racial wealth gap in this country, transportation issues, childcare, all these different things that get in the way of being able to vote, requires there to be a civic engagement organization to help you cast your ballots. And so what we're up against is people who have fewer obstacles to voting, more regular voter participation, and fierce determination to stop the changes that are happening. And so I had done this chart looking at voter turnout in Georgia, and it was very flat in 2010, 2014. And in 2018, it jumped up, and you can see it on this chart. And Stacey Abrams did massive voter mobilization to increase voter turnout, and that's what brought her so close to winning that race in 2018. But at the same time, white vote increased significantly, and the conservative white vote in these small counties. Because just as many black folks were like, yes, we can elect Stacey Abrams governor, you had a whole lot of conservative whites saying, hell no, we're not going to have her as governor. We're going to come out and vote. And so it's this very precarious battle between, can we get more of our folks, or they're getting more of theirs to come out? So it's on the one, there's a couple factors that are in our favor for the runoff with Warnock. is that there is a very strong civic engagement organization and network of groups who do voter turnout work among all the different groups of color in Georgia. The Georgia Votes Coalition that Leslie Small runs. And so that's one factor in our favor. The other factor, frankly, is that the control of the Senate is not at stake. And so there's less alarm, I think, on the part of the conservatives. Some of the reporters in Georgia were talking about that they kept hearing during the midterm elections was, we have to flip the Senate, we have to stop, Chuck Schumer, but that's not at play anymore. And so they might not have quite as much drive or motivation or animus to turn out, but our side still has more obstacles to voting. So it's going to be very close, but there are a couple of factors that weigh in our favor there.
That's excellent. It's funny that the third of the battle plan, the kind of Confederate battle plan you mentioned, distort public opinion. Certainly, when you evoke that in terms of what's going on now in Georgia, the Senate's not in play. It's interesting to see how public opinion can be distorted. Like, say, you're driving people to the polls, but given that point of entry, I want to ask you about Arizona, because certainly if Warnock wins, that diminishes some of the influence of Kristen Sinema. But I'm wondering, as a lawyer, and as a civil rights lawyer in particular, if you have any thoughts about Cochise County saying they're not going to certify the votes, while the political pundits are saying, well, that means maybe they'll flip a couple of seats to the, yeah, but remember that fifth element that you talk about, play the long game. Is the possibility of a county in a state not certifying a vote and getting away with it? What might that lay the groundwork for in the long game, Steve? Because I know you have a legal point of entry on this.
Well, that's a good question, because in the short term, that county is likely just not to have its votes counted, period, which actually hurts their candidate in terms of, so they're trying to, have that kind of petulant response to being part of the democracy. But you're right, in terms of the danger to the democracy in the long run. And this is in essence, and this is part why I say that the Confederates have never stopped fighting the Civil War. The Civil War, it didn't actually start as with shooting. It started with the Southern states refusing to accept the election results in an election where the candidate backed by Black people won. And they were like, no, we're not going to acknowledge his election. We're not going to honor the laws that are set up. We're going to completely separate ourselves and succeed. And so this is what is at stake, is that these counties, you see it also in terms of, sometimes you get these, you saw a lot in the kind of more the height of Black Lives Matter movement, some of these sheriffs in different counties will be like, well, we're not going to enforce these different laws. And so, which is what they did during the Civil Rights Movement, right? After King talked about interposition and nullification, and they not acknowledging, they didn't want to acknowledge and implement Brown versus Board of Education. And so it's a very similar pattern of trying to exempt yourself from the country and the government to which you belong and from which you get a whole bunch of money, when that part gets left out of it in terms of the resources that go to these places. But the trend is dangerous in that regard, because they are trying to lay the groundwork for not having to honor the laws of the country that we're all part of.
Yes. It's interesting. I have a couple more questions I want to ask you if I can get them squeezed in. One involves Texas. And as you were talking about J.D. Vance, and you mentioned J.D. Vance in passing, maybe curious as to if any thoughts you might have on why in Ohio, Tim Ryan didn't do as well as folks were hoping. But then Josh Shapiro running in Pennsylvania for governor seems to have struck that kind of coalition you're talking about to win a statewide election. And of course, the Pennsylvania State House chamber, one of the chambers switches hands. But in Texas, as you write extensively about demographics and about understanding culture and the culture, what are we facing when we ignore culture and just focus on demographics, because obviously there's no such thing as one Spanish speaking community. I mean, and we see in Texas attempts to make inroads by the Republicans among these Spanish speaking communities by appealing perhaps to this notion of values. I mean, what do we miss when we don't really dig into this question of culture and just simply think if somebody is a certain color, somehow their politics are all going to be the same?
Right. Well, one of the big parts of the culture piece is that it's also a way to increase civic participation in voting in ways that could be more widespread and more influential than just doing door knocking. Is that if it gets into the culture, people are talking about it and becomes the thing to do and exciting in that regard, it's a way to boost voter participation and turnout by moving in that direction. Georgia did some of this work in 2018 and 2020, bringing hip hop artists and doing online pieces with different cultural artists and whatnot. But the other part of the culture dimension is it needs to become part of the culture. Voting needs to become part of the cultural apparatus and operation. And so the reason Texas is still largely Republican controlled is because the voter turnout numbers are so vastly different between whites and people of color. The majority, whites are just 39% of the people within Texas. And even among the eligible voters, African Americans and Latinos, the majority of eligible voters within Texas. But the voter participation levels are so low among people of color that it distorts the picture of what the state's politics actually are. And so that's part of these pieces. So we did, we had created the country's first super PAC back in 2008. We ran these ads in South Carolina, and there was an ad, it featured a conversation in a Black beauty salon, and then in among a choir at a church. So trying to connect with the cultural realities of who the community was that we were trying to reach. And we were talking about even to the extent that so much of money gets spent on ads by consultants and whatnot, they're also culturally incompetent ads. And they're not by people who come from those communities, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I resonate with that. That's going to inspire me to participate.
Mm-hmm. Well, we only have a couple of minutes, but I wanted to squeeze this question in, Steve, and it has to do, and I'm glad you evoked the question of voter participation, even in the context of voter suppression, as you write about. And you contrast the United States with some other countries where there's even compulsory voting in some places, and certainly voter participation is much higher. Any thoughts about the possibility of building a new American society in a world system where we see, just like capital, money is transnational, neoliberalism, white supremacy in some ways is transnational. We see Bolsonaro in Brazil with all kind of consultants and people who come in here from the United States. And some people say, in the old joke being that foreign policy in the United States of America is mostly bipartisan. Can the United States build a different type of society in a world without engaging the rest of the world? I mean, where would you put the United States relative to the rest of the world as you think about these things?
Well, yeah, those are very good points. And people, I think there was a poster once saying that if capital can cross borders, why can't humans cross borders? Right. In terms of this level of like anti-immigrant focus, right? But I think there's different potential that we don't fully understand and appreciate. I remember I had a conversation once with Harry Belafonte, where he was talking about, can there be business relationships between the countries like in South America that grow coffee beans, and can they strike deals with entrepreneurs of color to create coffee shops in the United States? Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was very kind of intriguing and out of the box way of starting to think about it. Most of the people in the world are people of color. Most of the countries, the largest countries, are controlled by people of color. So what are the opportunities for partnership with Africa, with China, in terms of being able to engage those countries with the communities of color and to start to create a broader vision of what kind of society is possible? The businesses understand it. Talking Brown is the New White about how Starbucks had to become very culturally competent about China when it started to expand into China, which had largely been a nation of tea drinkers, but China as a Starbucks is a coffee company. And so they had to engage with the people locally there. There are opportunities, and we have allies across the world who are running countries. And that's something I think that it creates potential for us to strike sister cities, sister state types of collaborations and connections that can bring to bear the potential and the strength of our sisters and brothers across the world.
Absolutely. Well, brother, you talking about a whole revolution. but you've given us the pathway. I mean, like you said, all revolutions are local as well as global, and you've given us a pathway in both of these books. Steve Phillips, author of Brown is the New White, and the new book, which encourage everybody to get, How We Win the Civil War, Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good. Thank you so much, brother, for joining us for an hour here at the Black Table. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for your work.
Oh, man. Thank you. Thank you. We'll be back in a moment to clear the table and prepare for our next session here at the Black Table. Back in a moment.
Hatred on the streets, a horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds. As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol, we've seen we're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance. We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
Here's all the Proud Boys, guys.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Again, we want you to support the Black Star Network in every way possible and spread the word. I'm Greg Carr, your host for this show on the network. And we just heard Steve Phillips lay out not only a history of the United States of America and its struggle to become something other than what it was founded to be, but also give us very concrete steps on how to build a different type of society. And as he put it in a global context there near the end, I couldn't help but think about one of his comrades, a key component of the Jackson campaigns and Rainbow Coalition, the great Ron Walters, who wrote a book called Pan-Africanism and the African Diaspora, where he talks about these transnational relationships. And what we heard Steve Phillips do is give us not only information, but hope and inspiration and very practical steps toward building a kind of society where our common humanity overflows the boundaries of any hatreds or fears that might otherwise obstruct that common humanity. And with the climate doing what it's doing and human-induced climate change on the verge, we better get our act together soon before the ball resets and starts another species, and maybe we won't even be here to have this conversation. But we're grateful to Steve Phillips for joining us to give us a pathway to how we can perhaps avert that and a great deal more. So join us again next week here at the Black Table, and thank you for watching the Black Star Network. We'll see you soon.